Welcome to Book Club. I'm really into fun facts. Julie has an endless array of pop culture knowledge. Overall, I would say I liked it.
Something about the way she writes is like really concrete and immediate. Who is this man? Why is he in this costume? Like, why did he drop a squid? Like, you teased some juicy deets about the creation of this book.
This is, again, what Victoria finds interesting, not what is actually most important about these people.
What stories are we going to tell ourselves about this year?
Welcome to the party.
Welcome, guys.
Welcome to Book Club.
With Julia.
And Victoria.
This is a minisode.
This is a little interjection to our normal feed of talking about books to talk about related stories.
Specifically, the stories that we tell ourselves.
Yes.
This is a phrase I'm sure you have heard us, particularly Victoria, but us, say so many times. You're like, this seems to be a recurring theme in your podcast. You should make regular segments about it.
This is one of those.
That's what we're doing.
Yes. Often we talk about the stories we tell ourselves, how narrative shapes our idea of ourselves, of our memory, as individuals and as a collective society. And we thought we would make kind of a reoccurring segment of minisodes, probably a few times a year, where we check in on either big or small things that are shaping the stories that we continue to tell ourselves and, tie it into literature as relevant or as not relevant.
And broader culture as a whole, I feel like a lot of the books we read end up changing the story that we understand about history or about our country or whatever it may be. Yeah, it felt like a good opportunity. We're both now vaccinated.
Yeah.
And are starting to make some life changes. We're going to be moving out of our apartment in a couple months. It felt like kind of a place to check in and
and just discuss the stories we tell ourselves specifically about the COVID-19 pandemic. So
you did some research.
Well, I started with a question with myself. Why do I have a hard time remembering last summer? When people talk about summer 2020, and if they're talking about Black Lives Matter protests, they're talking about wearing masks and debates on whether or not we can go on vacation, if schools are going to open, I can remember specifics if I'm prompted, but in general my memory, I've caught myself multiple times being last summer, and I'm thinking about 2019. I'm thinking about a summer where I traveled a lot.
We moved
apartments and kind of went through some life changes when it comes to our roommates and living in Chicago, moving neighborhoods. That's what I think of when I think of last summer. And then it's oh, no. Last summer, 2020, I was unemployed because of the pandemic. We weren't going anywhere. I was having huge anxiety about everything in my life, more than I already do. Traveling to go see my family was this huge thing. I was scared to go to the gas station. Just things that feel kind of removed from where we're at today, but at the same time really aren't that far removed. It's only been a matter of weeks since we've been fully vaccinated, but we're already kind of living into this new phase of life for us as 20-somethings living in the US. But in reflecting back, and well, not necessarily reflecting, but researching back to the 1918 pandemic, it doesn't seem like I'm totally alone in this idea of just kind of washing over a really traumatic time in our global existence. Honestly, besides a couple references in history books to the Spanish influenza or the Spanish flu, which was the 1918 pandemic, another name for it, I really didn't know much about it until last year. Everyone was like, oh, right, remember that pandemic that our grandparents went through, or great-grandparents? And we're all huh, interesting. So there's a handful of historians and researchers who probably were getting pulled a million directions for every single interview. And they were like, I did not realize my work would become this relevant. Okay.
Yeah.
And in reading, we'll link in the show notes a couple of the articles that I was reading where, in broad strokes, it's basically people didn't want to fixate on it. Dying of this, the influenza was a really quick death for a lot of people. It really targeted 20 to 40-year-olds were the most hard hit.
Wow.
It was a young people's disease in a way. And it was coming off the heels of a really long and drawn out and traumatic war, but then also, the the attention of governments to be like, no, let's not talk about it. Let's talk about the fact that we just won a war for the Allied nations, and specifically the U.S. being like, look at us, we came in, swooped in, and here we are, like, helping make peace. While at the same time, Woodrow Wilson almost died of influenza while he was in Europe, like, helping write the treaty that ended World War I. So, yeah, it was a massive, massive deal, but we just kind of don't talk about it.
Yeah. My memory of learning about the Spanish flu is as, like, a footnote when you're learning about World War I, about how bad the conditions were for soldiers on the Western Front, of, like, in a list of trench foot and, like, rats and rain and whatever, and then also Spanish flu was happening at that time, and so a lot of them died from that. And then, this is so stupid, but Twilight. I saw a fair number of memes about, because Edward actually died from Spanish flu. That's his vampire origin story. And
I forgot about that.
Yes. And so, like, there are some Twilight memes of him, like, it just says, like, Spanish flu survivor or Spanish flu victim, like, getting super, he's, like, all in a hazmat suit and, like, he's, like, ready to go. I didn't read the books, but I watched the movie, and I was like, when was that? When was the Spanish flu? I was like, I couldn't place, I knew it happened, but I couldn't place it within broader history, because I either think of it as, like, a World War I disease, or, like, a separate event that happened in a totally different time that took the whole world. And it's hard for me to, like, put them together in my brain, because you're right, we spent maybe a sentence talking about it in history class.
Yeah. And it was, like, a terrible, ravaging pandemic. Like, reading the stats on it, I was like, oh gosh, I remember, like, yeah, that was bad, but it infected a third of the world's population was infected by it, and 50 million people died. So if you compare that to our current world population, that would be the equivalent of 220 million people dying.
Oh my god.
And for context, COVID-19, while it's killed a ton of people, it's only killed 3.43 million in comparison to what that disaster was. So not only is this, like, shaking our global public health and economies, and people's lives are, you know, affected in so many ways from the past year, and will continue to be as we fight the virus in a lot of contexts, you know. In the US, we're getting vaccinated fairly quickly compared to other countries, but there's a long way to go. Even knowing how, like, intense this experience has been for us, realizing how much more that pandemic affected people as far as number of fatalities is, like, jaw-dropping. But they also didn't have, I was listening to an interview from someone who studies infectious diseases. I think he's at University of Michigan. I forgot to write down his name. But he was talking about how there weren't pharmaceutical interventions at the time. So they only had things like social distancing, lockdowns, masks. They didn't have ventilators. They didn't have that vaccine. Like, it just kind of went away.
Really?
Is my understanding. I mean, someone can write in and tell me. But, like, we have the COVID-19 vaccine, Pfizer, Moderna, all these other ones. And within hours, they were able to identify which protein to use to start developing the vaccine. I mean, it took a while to develop it and test it and get it out for mass production. But, like, comparatively, it's so quickly because of our advances in modern medicine compared to what it was so long ago. But even, like, last March, we only had basically the same tools that they had back in 1918. Stay home, wear a mask.
Yeah, seeing the public health notices from 1918 and pictures from then was very eerie, because you're just like, oh great, we have exactly the same tools that they did 100 years ago. How exciting for us. And there were, like, anti-masks protests back then. And, like, I saw this one story, California had to, like, their mask mandate got repealed and then reinstated and repealed and reinstated over and over and over again over the course of those 3 years. And, like, it was a good reminder that, like, everything kind of repeats itself.
Yeah.
And people don't really change that much.
Yeah. There was an article in the New York Times talking about why aren't there more memorials to the 1918 pandemic, considering so many Americans died?
Yeah.
And it affected, they're talking globally, but one of the cases, or the examples, was in the U.S. They talked about the town of Barr, Vermont, where at the centennial of the 1918 pandemic, they actually built this like beautiful granite bench monument to the people who died of that disease. And the article was kind of comparing this against countries that did recognize the trauma and the devastating effects of previous pandemics and how it helped them in this current pandemic. So the example was New Zealand, where back in the 1918 pandemic, just over 9,000 people out of the 1 million people who lived in New Zealand at the time died. And when it came closer to the centennial, there was a professor, Jeffrey Rice, who wrote about and studied that pandemic, who was kind of lobbying like the New Zealand government of like, hey, let's build a memorial, let's do something to recognize what was happening. And so when, is it Jacinda? Mm-hmm. Jacinda Ardern, sorry, R's are hard for me, became prime minister, she's like, yes, let's do something. They have a plaque. And not only is it like, we put up a plaque, we recognize this happened, it's also, they had a plan. They had a pandemic plan that was revised on a regular basis. Like 2017, they did like a, if this would happen, what would our country do? Like, they had plans in effect, and we can see, yes, they're a much smaller country, they're an island. What's working for them doesn't necessarily work for every single country, but they had a plan, they executed it, and they saved the lives and health of so many of their citizens because they were able to contain COVID-19 so quickly and effectively.
Yeah, that story is like a great example of, we need to pay attention to and listen to our history and like internalize it and understand where we are in context so that when things happen, we can understand the implications of our actions and like what things mean in a broader scale and try not to repeat our old mistakes. And I really don't want us to just completely forget this time and just push it under the rug. And partly because I think so many things, good and bad, have been uncovered this year. I, in my mind, and also probably with other people in conversation, have been using the word apocalyptic to talk about this time because it sort of has two meanings of like apocalypse in terms of like the end of the world, but also its original meaning from Greek means to like uncover or reveal. And I think about what we talked about in the Coates episode. We were 8 years in power, of like all of the kind of narratives that the US in particular has used to kind of paint over our dark past. I think COVID didn't really give us a choice. It just sort of ripped the Band-Aid off and was like, this is your country. This is your world. These are your friends. This is your family. You know what I mean? Like, you gotta take a good hard look, and then we all had to spend a very long time alone with ourselves and our thoughts. And like, this is you. What are you gonna do with it? And I think it, in both good ways and bad, revealed a lot about who we really are. And I hope we use it instead of saying, because I can already see the tendency to shove it down and to forget about it, and any good that's associated with this really traumatic time to just bury it all, throw out the baby with the bathwater and just like, we don't want to think about any of it. And that really scares me, because then we'll just repeat all the same things that we've been perpetuating for so long.
Yeah, let's talk about some of those specific things that,
sure,
from like a social and global impact. One of the first things that comes to mind for me is the way that we have in the US been so dependent on the unpaid labor of women specifically, but also the
preach
the really shaky structures that families have to support raising children.
Yeah.
Like, we live in a country where, in a lot of places, for a lot of people, it's not economically feasible to be a one-income household when you have children. It's a lot of expenses. Both parents working often is what needs to happen. And when we have things in place, like in-person schooling and childcare, then families have some sort of semblance of structure, but we saw how quickly that can go away and how there is very little, in many places, not all, but in many places, very little government response that would actually support these families during this time. And so now, as the economy is opening up more jobs are coming back, people are wondering, like, why are employers having a hard time hiring? And there's a lot of factors, but one of them is that, well, schools and a lot of childcare in some locations is still not available. And
children aren't vaccinated
yet.
yet.
Children aren't vaccinated yet. And some parents, I would say, reasonably have reason to be concerned.
Yeah.
And may not want to, even if they do have some options, may not be ready to like make that choice for themselves to be back in a vulnerable place or for their children. And I unfortunately don't see a ton of movement to necessarily fix that. I mean, Biden's infrastructure plan did include childcare as a key component of, like, that's a social structure. Like,
yeah,
like
like 2 free years of
infrastructure.
preschool or something.
Something like that, which of course was like immediately rejected by the Republican Party of like, we don't need that. Like, that's not infrastructure. Like, that doesn't count, quote unquote. And it's like, well, we saw what happens when we don't have it.
Yeah.
It means a lot of people leave the workforce, including women, mostly women. And, you know, of course, the added stress of being unemployed potentially, or like not having your normal village of people to help care for your children can put an undue and extra stress on families. So that's the big thing for me that comes out of this, of like, parents put in so much work, schools, mental health providers put in so much work, and our government can be doing more. And our society can be doing more to recognize that, like, you know, Julie and I were fully vaccinated, we're like ready to go on vacations, we're having a good time, and like going back into the world, but our friends and colleagues who have children are still very much living within the pandemic and still making difficult decisions of what feels safe and unsafe for their families.
Yeah, for me, the social supports, I feel like, I mean, the US is just so incredibly stingy when it comes to social support and infrastructure. We're just downright cruel in a lot of ways in terms of the lack of support that we provide people. And we're just like, suck it up. One of the things, sort of on the opposite end of the spectrum, like, parents have been hit very, very, very hard because all the social structures were taken away during the pandemic. Sort of on the opposite side, the disabled community has finally gotten the accessibility social support. Not all, but a lot of the accessibility that they've been craving and asking for years, because the whole country needed it. And so people were allowed to work from home. A lot of job postings were like, you can live anywhere. You don't need to move here. There was a lot of part-time or contract work available. There was flexible hours. There was like the rise of Zoom hangouts, the way that streaming services and production companies have started simultaneous film releases where they'll do theater and streaming service release on the same day. All sorts of different stuff where, like, disabled people have been able to participate in the world on the same level as everyone else for the first time in their whole lives. I get really anxious that that's all about to go away because it was a temporary measure, or people associated with COVID and they just want to sweep it under the rug. They don't want to think about it, or it's not as good as the real thing, quote unquote, right? This craving for like in-person experiences and whatever. I know for me, I have chronic fatigue. I've like chronic conditions. I'm autistic. Like, the world makes me very tired very quickly. And so, like, I spent the first few years of my adult life just kind of barely surviving. And this year, while like on a mental health level was incredibly difficult, it slowed down the pace of my life and shrank the size of my world to a level where I was significantly less overwhelmed, so that I could actually focus on understanding. I, made some health discoveries. I was finally able to get a good medication that I needed. I was able to sleep as much as I needed to. I was able to make some, to try some things, to kind of experiment with different mental health resources or social resources, or try different habits, try to build some patterns, like whatever it is, stuff that takes a lot of mental energy. I had the capacity to do it because, everything was so much smaller. And these are tools that I can now take with me into the rest of my life that I may have never had the time or space or energy to develop, and I may have just continued with some really exhausting and harmful patterns that were really not sustainable, and were causing a lot of meltdowns. And like the thing that makes me really anxious now is not, I mean, yes, the desire to forget this whole year and just push it aside as like the worst year ever, and to go out without a mask, and like to kind of eliminate all the precautions that we took over the past year. That makes me nervous. But I also feel this sense of like, oh shit, I'm gonna get left behind again. I finally felt like I was keeping up with everyone else, and I have never felt like that before in my entire life. And I can already feel it slipping away, and it scares the shit out of me. So I'm honestly kind of dreading the world trying to go back completely to the way it was, because I'm scared that I can't handle it, and I've built up a lot of resources that I think I will be able to, but I don't know. Disability community friends and mutual Tumblr followers seem to agree, and particularly those who are much more homebound than I am, they're even more so worried about being left behind and all of the resources that they've had access to over the last year just being gone and being left alone again. Like, that's part of the story of this year for me, is like a journey of self-discovery, in a sense, a building up of skills and tools and personal resources, and like creating patterns in my life that I can actually use for the rest of my life that aren't gonna kill me. And figuring out how to be autistic in my body without masking and all kinds of things. But I want everyone else to remember what helped. Like, what technologies, what resources did we develop during this time that made our lives easier? I want everyone to remember how nice it was because everyone was going through the same thing. People were, at least who I talked to, were much more understanding of like mental health needs, of like, I really can't work on that this morning. This happened and I'm incredibly anxious. Can I take some time? I'll talk to you in the afternoon. Or I need to go take a nap. Or like the flexibility of not having to be in the office all the time, or like realizing how exhausting the 40-hour work week is, and that no human being was built to work that much. And it's a work schedule that's built around on the assumption that you have a spouse at home doing all of the work for you, like cooking your meals and cleaning your house and all the things, so that all you have to do when you get home is sit on the couch. That's not how we live anymore. Like, no one can handle a 40-hour work week. It's not good for you. Especially if you have to take care of yourself and have a social life and take care of your mental health and all these things. And it's even less good for disabled people. We can't handle a 40-hour work week for a wide variety of reasons. But I want people to remember what they gained from that broader accessibility and that flexibility. And I don't want that to go away. So, yeah.
I would say for me, the story I tell myself of COVID-19, it echoes a lot of that as far as like, don't forget what worked. Definitely like the most intense period of prolonged anxiety that I've experienced in my life. And so recognizing like, yeah, those tools that were really effective and helpful. And I am super grateful for things like telehealth became like a thing. Like I could have appointments with my therapist, not dependent on when I can physically get to her office, but just like more in tune with my everyday life. And so I could take a 3 p.m. appointment because I didn't have to travel to get there. And I could just make up my work hours later because I had that flexibility from working from home. The fact that my insurance provider made telehealth zero copay.
Right.
I didn't have to pay for therapy for months, which was incredible. So I hope a lot of those tools continue to stick with me, and by reflecting on it, we can continue to carry those forward with us. It was also a period of like a silver lining of getting laid off while really stressful at the time was that I was able to do deeper reflection on like what I really wanted out of my work life. And I did take a job because I had to for a while. I didn't absolutely love it, but I had like a decent enough experience and was happy to be employed for a while. And that gave me the flexibility to continue reflecting on what I actually wanted to do. And now I'm a full-time freelancer and working for myself. And I actually love working from home. Like I love that, like, you know, every week or two, I will do like a virtual coffee date with a colleague or a friend. I have roommates that I can talk to, a partner. Like, that's enough of, like, a daily social interaction that I can check that box. Like, my work life feels social enough, but then I can just, like, really dig in and get stuff done. I don't have to commute anymore. So I'm excited for those pieces to stay. Yeah, there's a lot in here. We've kind of sprinkled across a lot of ways that COVID-19 continues and will continue to impact our lives. And I think back to last April, I think it was, kind of in the depths of my despair.
April was rough for you.
It was. I wrote I saw something on Instagram or social media where it's like, you should write down what's happening right now. Like, this is an incredibly unique experience that you're going through right now. Like, this might be helpful to kind of write about it. And so I wrote a letter as if I'm trying to explain to a child in the future what we were going through and like what was happening and what we were scared about. And like, it was actually really therapeutic to like write this while I was going through like the thick of it, of like complete uncertainty. Felt like I had no sense of security around me. Being able to write about, you know, we were really scared for these reasons and we didn't know when it was going to end, but it's ended and now we know what to do. And so I kind of wrote it in the idea of like, in 30 years, if there's another pandemic, being able to tell a child like, you know what, this is super scary, but we've done this before. Like, we know how to get through this. So, I mean, probably wrote that to my inner child more than the future child, but we're already crafting that story, I guess, as we continue to live through this.
Yeah, and I think as much as I'm scared that like we're gonna, as a society, going to try to forget everything and push it all under the rug, I've also seen a lot of revolution, big and small, personal and political. I mean, I just the number of people in our home, the percentage of our home that have quit their jobs. We just had a little party for Varun yesterday. We were just like, quit your job, because we're just like, our standards for what we're willing to put up with, we're like, we're not gonna put up with that bullshit anymore. These are the things that I need, and I see that kind of demand out in the world too. I mean, the whole like, we don't want to work anymore thing. There was a big McDonald's strike, like demanding $15 an hour. I don't even know if it worked.
I believe McDonald's and Chipotle are both increasing their pay to $15 an hour. Bank of America recently, their minimum is $25 an hour, which is like a big move in the banking sector. And being such a big bank, it's kind of like where they go, others will follow, hopefully. So it is kind of exciting to see that even if we're not going to get it from a government level, that the will and force of the employees with the also like just recognition from employers that we can pay more because we want we want decent employees.
Yeah.
We want people to actually apply to our jobs. It's like, yeah, people don't want to go back to working $7.25 an hour, 8-hour shifts
Yeah.
at a restaurant, and like,
people are burnt out
yeah,
and they're exhausted and they're like realizing, especially people who were essential, quote unquote, essential workers during this time. They're like, oh, if I'm so essential, why are you treating me like garbage?
Yeah.
You know, like that makes me really excited that, you know, I see it in the people I interact with and what I see in the news. I'm really hoping that everyone who has been disproportionately harmed and disadvantaged during this period, like, we can recognize that all of us collectively deserve better, and we can all support each other in our collective and individual efforts to get that for ourselves. So that makes me very excited.
yeah. So we want to hear from you guys. Like, what's the
Mhm.
story that you were telling yourself? What are the narratives that are really shaping how you think back on this past year and a half, and how you hope to or plan to continue thinking about the pandemic as we move forward, hopefully, out of it?
Yeah.
As a community of book club members and
Yeah.
readers, but also as a global community as well.
Mhm.
So, yeah, you can submit a message on our website. It goes to our email. You can hit us up on Instagram. If you know us personally, you could text us.
You could text us. Or you could become a member
Yeah.
on our Buy Me a Coffee page, and for only $3 a month, and you can send us direct messages on there.
Yeah.
Which is great.
Yes. Thank you to all of our book club members who
Yes.
keep making the show possible.
Absolutely. We love you so much.
All right. We'll catch you guys on our next full-length book episode.
Yes, I am not done with the book.
It's okay. It'll happen.
It'll happen. Bye, guys.
Bye. Thanks for joining us for this episode of Book Club with Julia and Victoria. Chime in with your own thoughts and recommendations on Instagram at bookclubwithjv or through the contact form on our website, www.bookclubwithjv.com. Our website is also where you can find show notes for this episode, which include links to any of the recommendations we gave or other tidbits we mentioned. Make sure to follow us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you're currently listening, and leave us a 5-star review on Apple while you're there. This episode was co-hosted and produced by myself, Victoria Bruick, along with Julia Clausen. Our music is composed by Greg Bruick. Our logo was designed by Gabby Febland, and Rebecca Gesney is our project manager. We'll catch you all on our next episode. Happy reading!